Joining us right now from Washington is Mieke Eoyang, Vice President of Third Way National Security Program and an expert on national security strategy, and Timothy Naftali, a presidential historian who is in Sacramento, California tonight. And Mieke, let me begin with you as you heard the president and then heard the Secretary of Defense and Pentagon officials. What's your reaction to what the United States, the UK, and France has done tonight?
I think no one across the world is crying any tears for Assad after his use of chemical weapons. However, I do think that there are some really serious questions about the longer-term implications of these strikes. I think you really have to wonder whether or not they will deter Assad from further use of chemical weapons. We've seen 3 different times where he's come up to the precipice, first in the Obama administration, and then again previously a year ago with this administration. And he's continued to use chemical weapons in ways that are very obvious and really horrific to behold. There's no reason to think that he will actually stop his use of chemical weapons, though it may die down for a while. But his ability to manufacture chemical weapons, the difficulty of trying to confirm that the chemical weapons stores have actually been destroyed or he doesn't have other secret stores is very difficult. And he's very much incentivized to try and completely eliminate his opposition, since this is a question of his own personal and his regime's survival.
Tim, you've studied a lot of presidents over the years. We went from the unusual spectacle, I guess would have been unusual prior to Trump becoming president, of the tweets that he sent out for days that were filled with emotion about what he was going to do in regards to Syria. And then tonight, giving a speech clearly sticking, it appeared, to what was on the prepared part of the statement. Your reaction to both what the president has announced tonight and how he announced it?
Well, this is a very important moment in the Trump administration, and it's an important moment actually in sort of allied handling of the Syrian civil war. Well, what we saw tonight was the teleprompter Trump, and what that means is that there was a real serious discussion in the White House about options. Over a week ago, some people might recall, Donald Trump was angry at his advisors for suggesting that the United States had a reason to stay militarily involved in Syria in the next few months. He very much wanted out of that civil war. What I think his advisors convinced him of, or at least persuaded him tonight, was that the United States has been sending the wrong message to Russia. You know, in 2012, President Obama drew a red line and said that the use of chemical weapons would be unconscionable and unacceptable by the Assad regime. The Assad regime then crossed that line. As a result, the United States and Russia together thought or said that they had achieved the removal of chemical weapons from Syria. Well, of course, we know that's not true, because obviously there wouldn't have been these targets to hit tonight. Last year, the Syrians used chemical weapons yet again, and the Trump administration sent a small and ultimately ineffectual attack on a very limited area, an isolated area. So this year, the question was, is the United States and are its allies serious enough about what the use of chemical weapons in a wanton fashion represents to do something about it? And tonight, they decided to do it. The fact that the French, who have a serious challenge with all the migrants that are coming into Europe, that they joined, shows me, at least, that this is a very serious effort, and it's not going to stop tonight. I'm not suggesting that they've decided on regime change, but don't be surprised if more attacks are volleyed in the near future by Britain, the United States, and France.
But if I heard correctly, Secretary of Defense Mattis said this was, for now, a one-shot deal. Now, the president also said this is about deterrence, and they'll sustain their action until they get that deterrence. But explain for us why you feel like you're seeing indications here that this action will continue.
Well, because a couple of reasons. Number one, the rhetoric they're using, yes, they said it was going to be limited, but they also talked about Assad being a monster, a madman. They're saying to Assad that the goal now is to get him to participate in the United Nations negotiations to end the civil war. If the United States, France, and Great Britain want the Assad regime to fully participate in the UN process, which, by the way, is a very good idea, they're going to have to put more pressure on Assad. I think tonight is a signal that those three countries have decided they are not going to accept Assad in power indefinitely.
Mieke, I know your expertise is in security issues, and we're looking at this broad global security issue, but you are also in Washington, D.C. We're watching this from Canada. Give us a sense of how you think all of this is going to play in the United States. You know, it's the president making a decision about foreign policy in a very politically charged environment in an election year. What are some of the considerations?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of skepticism here in Washington about the president's sincerity in trying to address the situation in Syria, given that he has been otherwise emotionally tweeting about this investigation into whether or not he was involved with the Russians during the 2016 campaign and after the raid on his personal lawyer in New York, where a whole series of documents were sealed. So a lot of people think that this may be a phrase that we call here wag the dog, an attempt to distract the American people from the president's personal political woes with an international strike. Now, that is balanced against the questions that people have about the effectiveness of this strike in particular. This situation in Syria has been going on for quite some time. The mere presence of Assad continues to embolden a whole range of opposition figures to be attracted to Syria, to continue this civil war. Assad is not interested in leaving, and it's not in the interest of the Russians to have him lead. So it's not clear that any peace process in Geneva or anywhere else is going to yield a result that Western powers will be happy with. So there's some real question about how the president intends to achieve an end where Assad will actually be deterred and where chemical weapons will stop being used against civilians in Syria. So I think both on the geopolitical and on the political front, there is tremendous skepticism about what the president is doing.
Mieke, there's so many considerations here. You mentioned some of them. Also, it's how Russia might or might not react. So, you know, a president has to try to balance all those things. And he went from, you know, those tweets. I keep going back to the tweets that seemed so unpresidential to what he announced tonight. That I mean, did from the perspective of watching this 2 hours after the attacks were launched, is it possible that he got it right, the balance between taking action against Syria, but at the same time not inflaming the situation beyond that?
I think it's possible, and he was heavily guided by the Pentagon and Secretary Mattis in that. The question is whether or not that this action remains, as Secretary Mattis has said, a one-off and calibrated attack to send a strong message to Assad. It does do long-term damage to the international order and the idea of when force is used and how we reach international consensus to do that. The Chemical Weapons Convention does not have provisions in it for its enforcement through military action. And the Security Council did not vote in favor of such a strike, as we saw actually in other conflicts that we've dealt with. So I think that what we're seeing here is a real challenge where the president, when guided by his military and guided by regular order, continues to provide a more normal response. However, what you see in his tweets is the president unfiltered, left to his own devices, what he really feels.
Tim, when daylight comes in Moscow, we certainly will start hearing official reaction from Vladimir Putin, or at least someone speaking on his behalf. In Syria, with daylight, we will see more detail on the extent of these attacks. What are some of the questions and perhaps concerns you have at this hour?
Well, I think it's highly unlikely that the Russians did not know about these chemical weapons facilities. So the Russians knew full well that the Syrians had these facilities, and the Russians had publicly participated in 2013 in a campaign with the United States to prevent Assad from engaging in the use of chemical weapons. So they clearly didn't care about their credibility on the issue. So it's going to be very hard for the Russians to seek sympathy, international sympathy, for the fact that Assad, until tonight, had a really strong chemical weapons capability. I expect in Damascus, unfortunately, that some civilians will have been killed. I mean, it just happens, and that would be terrible. And I suspect the Syrian government will be very deceptive about what, in fact, was hit, and we will learn if, indeed, sadly, there is, I don't like to use the word collateral damage because that dehumanizes it, but if civilians were killed. But I really believe that although Donald Trump has great reason to distract the world and the United States, the American people, Macron and Theresa May would not have participated in a wag the dog event. Clearly, the French and the UK have come to the conclusion this was the only way to prevent more chemical attacks in Syria. And if a tyrant can do this in Syria, a tyrant can do it elsewhere. And as human beings, this is something we want to prevent.
So is it possible the president did the right thing tonight, Tim?
Oh, I believe that the three leaders, I'm not just focusing on Trump. This was three sovereign governments that participated in it. I think the British, the French, and the United States did what they had to do tonight.
All right, Tim and Mieke, thank you very much for your analysis this evening.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian.